super excited to have an awesome team of panelists. I'm going to go ahead and start off with a few housekeeping items. So due to the number of participants today, we've automatically muted your phones to eliminate interferences. Please enter any questions or comments into the chat box. If you have something to add to the conversation, please note it in the chat box and we'll call on you. You may also send any questions to professional@asce.org. Please turn your video off to avoid sharing your video with this group or being captured in the recording. We will be recording today's session. Please also close all other applications, especially email, so that your system will run smoothly. And please keep all conversations geared towards the benefit of the community and today's topic. So with that being said, we want to start off today's roundtable with introductions from our panelists. Then each panelist will share their perspectives and insights on the topic of the intersection of infrastructure and economic policy in the Biden administration. So the panelists will also respond to any questions from the audience. So again, fabulous panel today. So please make sure you take advantage of their expertise and ask as many questions as possible. So we'll go ahead and turn to Andrew Herman first. Andrew, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Andy Herman. I was the 2012 president of ASCE, and I've been involved with the report cards for probably since 2001 report card, and I had the honor of being the chairman of the committee to put out the 2009 report card. They've come a long way. I mean, from the early pamphlets to the published books, and now we have so much data and information available online that we have so much more to share. And that's something that ASE is trying to do with government and the public. So I look forward to talking about the report card and also the ASE failure to act economic study a little bit later.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. Ed, I'll go ahead and turn to you next. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Ed Mortimer. I'm Vice President of Transportation Infrastructure at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Also serve as the Executive Director of the Americans for Transportation Mobility, which is a coalition. We're in our 20th year, where we have business, labor, and ASCE has been a founding member of this coalition to kind of promote the interest of getting infrastructure modernization. So, I too want to applaud all of you who have been involved in the report card. I have a lot more to say about it as we go on, but I think the report card has really provided the opportunity to springboard a discussion long overdue at the federal level to talk about modernizing all of our infrastructure. So I look forward to participating in this conversation.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time in joining us today. And Caroline, I'll turn to you next.
Good afternoon, everyone. Caroline Severe. I'm the Director of Government Relations at ASCE, and I work with both our federal lobbying team as well as our state government relations programs, really trying to make sure that all of your voices are heard on Capitol Hill and at state houses across the country. We also have a key contact program where we try to make sure we have all of our ASCE members engaged and really working with their policymakers, and I can talk a bit more on some of those programs as we go into today's program.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have this conversation, but to start off, I'll go ahead and start with our kickoff question. So as Ed had mentioned, infrastructure seems to be all over the headlines lately, with Congress and the Biden administration both committed to moving a package this year, but with a heightened discussion, the release of the 2021 report card for America's infrastructure earliest this month seems especially fortuitous. So before we get into a discussion about what to expect for the year, historically, what has been the impact of the report card with policymakers, and do you see it shaping the infrastructure debate? So I'll go ahead and start off with Andy. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the past.
In the past, the report card is very well, it's accepted very frequently on the Capitol Hill. ASE has a fly-in once a year, and we actually bring the report card and infrastructure issues to our congressmen, our senators, and we talk about some of these key infrastructure items. I remember one visit where we went and sat down with one of the secretaries for a transportation committee, and she took the report card and said, "This is fantastic. I have all the data that I need for the next year on infrastructure." So it's very well accepted on the Hill.
Awesome. Ed, I'll go ahead and turn to you next.
Yeah, let me take off where Andy started that conversation, because I think he's right. It is kind of the gold standard when we're looking at defining infrastructure, and I'll give ASC a lot of credit. You've added some new asset classes. So to have the 17 asset classes and the breakdown, I think has opened some eyes, particularly, some of the stormwater, the wastewater. They're really eye-opening. And I know some people said, well, we got a C-. That's great. That's not the grade any of us would want. If those of us who have children, not the ones we want them to come home with. But I think I will also give ASC a lot of credit and the evolution of the report card. It's gone from, yes, we know the numbers are high, and I know Andy's going to talk about some of the details on the numbers. They're mind-numbing, to be blunt. But I think what ASC did this year that we are copying at the chamber, and I can tell you in talking to members of Congress has been very effective, is highlighting projects around the country, putting a face to these numbers, right? We all know the grades are not where they need to be, but the way you release the report card, when you had the 17 asset classes, they were all released at different projects around this country. They put a face to it. So it's not just another report that you put on your desk. I thought the rollout this year was able to bring it to life, was able to show people some real world examples of projects. And hopefully that will catapult us to a place where, because, one of the things we found at the local level, when we identify projects that are going to get funded, we're able to be successful there. It's a lot more challenging to do that at the federal level, but I think the rollout of the report card and some of the tools that have been used this year have made it easier for us to kind of identify, hey, if we do this major federal infrastructure bill, these are the types of projects that are going to get invested in. These are the type of improvements to climate that we can make. These are the types of improvements to make sure that folks that may have been underserved by some infrastructure decisions 50 years ago can be better served with modern infrastructure. So again, I think the evolution of the report card, I've been around a few years. I don't want to say how long, but I've seen the evolution of it, and I really applaud ASCE and many of you. I know that there's a huge committee, and many of the members of ASCE in one way or another participate in the tabulation of the report card, but it really did make a difference this year. It's always important, but I think in this year it put a face to it, and hopefully we can take that momentum and move it to get a federal bill enacted into law this year.
Absolutely. I'll turn to Caroline next. I know, report card's so important, something you work with every day, right?
It is, and I would say that Andy and Ed really hit the nail on the head about some of the impacts that we've seen with the report card. Since we first started doing the report card back in 1998, I think we've really seen not just the report card itself start to really evolve, but really it started to shape the conversation around infrastructure and has been central over the past 2 decades for shaping that conversation. Whereas last February of 2020, we actually saw the presidential candidates come together and have an actual debate surrounded just on infrastructure, which was the first time we had ever seen that. And I think the report card has really played a part in driving that conversation and making policymakers really look at how our nation's infrastructure is impacting our economy, impacting public health, and impacting families across the country. And the report card paired with the failure to act report really starts to illustrate what those how our infrastructure is impacting families and why it is so critical for Congress to be making these investments now. And it's not just putting up the grades and having kind of those big numbers on what this is going to cost, which is kind of what always makes the headlines, but it also provides real solutions on how we can be raising those grades. So it's not just kind of 3 high-level solutions like resilience, for example, but there are solutions embedded in every single one of those 17 categories that policymakers can look at as a guide as they're trying to put legislation out there that can really have an impact. And we hope that this time around, that as Congress is trying to put together an infrastructure package, that they're using some of those recommendations in each of those categories as they're writing legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important, and that's something that's definitely like on the forefront of everyone's minds, right? So that kind of brings us to our next question. I just do want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat box. great team of panelists today, so please feel free to ask as many questions as possible. But that kind of brings us, Caroline, to our next point, which, Ed, I'll turn to you. If we've talked about what to expect at a higher level, but could you walk through what action we might expect from Congress on infrastructure this year?
Absolutely. Appreciate the question. Look, I think we're going to see some major action in a bunch of areas. Actually, how this all plays out is still to be determined. Obviously, I think the delay in getting the COVID relief bill done pushed back the administration's efforts to move forward. Here's what we know. Next Thursday, the House Transportation Committee is going to hold a hearing where the Secretary Buttigieg is going to have testify on laying out the administration's broad parameters for an infrastructure bill. So that kind of really begins the discussion. We know the Transportation Committee, they've had some hearings in both the House and Senate. Caroline and I have both been in meetings with staff on the Environment and Public Works and T&I committees. Right now, what they're working on from those two committees is kind of a surface transportation reauthorization and some work in the water sector. Some of the clean water, drinking water programs that didn't get included in WRDA. So the authorizing committees are moving forward on work on that. In the House side, the Energy and Commerce Committee is looking at clean energy. They're looking at broadband. They've introduced some bills. They're going to have some hearings. Where this appears to be coming together, it looks like the May timeframe is when that we've been told that the House Transportation Committee and that the Environment and Public Works Committee are going to mark up and move bills addressing surface and water. The water may actually come first in the Senate. It may come as early as April. And then so that April time frame, we'll start seeing bills move through committee. Now, how they get to the floor and how it gets to conference and gets to the president's desk, still to be determined. Those of you who read the media clips, I think the administration and Congress, particularly on the majority side, are trying to figure out, do they do it through regular order, which is usually a more bipartisan effort, or do they do it through what's called reconciliation? And I'll spare you what that means. But in the short term, it means that they can pass some things that they did this with the COVID relief bill. They can pass things with just 50 votes in the United States Senate, which there are 50 Democrats right now. We have been encouraging the more bipartisan solutions, because if you really look at long-term policy in this country, it's usually done on a bipartisan basis. We built the interstate highway system. We built a lot of our infrastructure with federal efforts on a bipartisan level. So again, we're hopeful that that will be the case, but you have to be a realist. And, you know, we want to see bipartisanship, but at the end of the day, I'm sure engineers only care about, is there a bill that actually gets signed into law that you all can see state DOTs, transit agencies, other of your clients who say they have investment money and they're ready to build. That is the goal. So let's not get hung up on some of the legislative vehicles. Yes, we'd love to see bipartisanship. I think it will be bipartisan at points during the process. It may not be during the whole process, but you know, it's going to take all sides compromising a little bit. Everybody's going to have to give. And our hope is that because of the work that many of you on this call have done and many other stakeholders, we got ourselves to the place where this is truly a national issue. Everyone on this call knows it's been an issue for many years, but we've really been clawing and fighting to get it at the federal level. It's there now. So now we have that opportunity to kind of punch it into the end zone. And so it's going to take all of our efforts to kind of remind your members of Congress what this means to you, your company, the jobs that can be created, and the wonderful designs that engineers can do if they're given the investment levels to do it. We know that you all have the innovation and technology to build a modern infrastructure. We just need that federal vision and leadership to get it done. And we think this is the year that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
If I could just add to that, one thing that we've been watching that's been extremely encouraging as they've started to have hearings, as they're starting to develop legislation, is that we're really seeing an increased focus, both sides of the aisle and in both chambers on resilience and how we can make sure resilience is incorporated in any sort of infrastructure package going forward. And that's been one of the core tenets of ASCE. It's one of the core tenets of the report card. So continuing to see Congress really starting to ramp up their efforts and taking a concerted effort on how they can be building more resiliently and truly making sure we're building back better is an encouraging sign and something that we're going to continue to push as we see a package come forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is so important, and it is so encouraging. And I think, Ed, one of the things that you had mentioned was, maybe some give and take from an ASCE perspective. Caroline, what are the priorities that ASCE is going to make here?
Much like what Ed said, one of our key priorities right now and going forward, and for any piece of legislation that we support, is we really are pushing for Congress to work in a bipartisan fashion to come up with some sort of package here. Infrastructure has historically been a bipartisan issue, and we'd like to continue to see it be bipartisan and not get some of that more partisan rhetoric coming out when it comes to our infrastructure sectors. We think this is something that everybody should be getting behind, and would like to make sure we see bipartisan legislation coming out of both chambers. But another thing that we're really excited about and that we're really urging Congress for is, while we work very closely, for example, with Ed through groups like the Americans for Transportation Mobility, and we absolutely want to see a surface transportation reauthorization bill before September 30th, but we also are really encouraged, and we want to see some of these other investments made into our nation's drinking water and wastewater systems, our stormwater systems, the grid, our dams and levees, etc., and kind of try to make sure we're trying to raise the grades for all of those infrastructure sectors, and not just see a more traditional road and bridge bill, but make sure we're kind of hitting on everything as we're going forward. And as the new administration came in and as the 117th Congress convened, we actually had shared some of our key priorities for any infrastructure package, surface transportation bill going forward. And that is to make sure that we're preparing for a more resilient future. So going back to that resilience piece that I said we're so encouraged about before, but we also want to make sure that we're really prioritizing asset management and operations and maintenance needs as we're going forward. So it's not just about building the new shiny thing, but we have to make sure we're maintaining what we currently have. And then making sure, even though sometimes it could, it may sometimes seem more expensive when we're developing life cycle cost analysis and asset management plans, we think that's really critical to make sure that we're building strong, resilient infrastructure. And then last but not least, we need to reinstate really a strong federal partner when it comes to our infrastructure investments. The Highway Trust Fund is really a prime example of this. The gas tax hasn't been raised since 1993. And we need to see this. We need to see this being addressed. We need to see the Highway Trust Fund being addressed. We need to see things like the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to be reauthorized again, and see those investments coming out and just restoring that federal partnership. We've seen states and localities doing a lot of work raising funding, especially raising their gas taxes over the past 2 decades, while the federal government has not acted. But those investments that we've seen from state and local governments are really only doing enough to kind of help us tread water, which is why you haven't seen that roads grade go up and why you've actually seen our bridge grade go down. So, we need the federal government to step in order to really make that difference and start to look at the Highway Trust Fund and how we can make sure the Highway Trust Fund is going to be solvent going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you brought up a few of the grades and specifically what they happen, but I want to turn to Andy next. I know you've been a longtime member of the Committee on America's Infrastructure, which actually develops the report card. I'm wondering if maybe you could share some of the findings in a little bit more detail for the 2021 report card, Andy.
All right. Well, we're, I guess we could say happy, but it's sort of not a full range happiness. The grades actually went up. We went from a D+ overall grade point average back in 2017 to a C-. Now, mind you that C- consists of 11 Ds, 4 Cs, and just 2 Bs. We did have 5 category grades: aviation, drinking water, energy, inland waterways, and ports actually go up incrementally. And just 1 category, bridges, actually went down. So what we're looking at is that our infrastructure is pretty much stagnant, and we've really not done the investment we have to do for the past 4 years and the past 20 years. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later is that the total cost over the next 10 years to get our infrastructure up to a grade of B is 2.6 trillion with a T dollars. And that's up from our 2017 report card, which was only $2.1 trillion. When we do visit our congressmen, even though it was virtually, we do go in and talk to them about infrastructure in general across the country. But ASE also has individual state report cards, which we bring with us, because the legislators always want to know what's happening in their states, what's happening in their counties. So that is also available online. So people can actually go to the ASE.org website and click on their states and find out what the condition of infrastructure is there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy, you bring up a great point about, talking to state legislatures. Caroline, I'm wondering, ASCE held its very first virtual fly-in this month. Can you share a bit about what ASE members discussed during the event, as well as what feedback they received and how other ASE members might get involved?
Absolutely. You're right. We held our first ever virtual fly-in in conjunction with the report card release earlier this month. We had a little over 250 ASCE members participate in that, and they hit just under 300 congressional offices. And during all of those meetings, they shared their 2021 report card, they shared the grades, and they shared some of the solutions in order to raise those grades and really urged their members of Congress to pass an infrastructure package this year. And that really the time's of the essence. Let's get something done this summer. And they can use the report card as a guidepost as we're going forward here. A lot of those conversations also really focused on our surface transportation programs and the Highway Trust Fund, and making sure that we are again restoring that reliable federal partner when it comes to the Highway Trust Fund. And we also really had our members focus in on resilience. There's a few different pieces of legislation that are out there right now that are kind of, I'll say, more low-hanging fruit. It's not, finding that solution to the Highway Trust Fund, but simple things like making sure that our engineers have the data that they need from groups like NOAA to make sure they're building dams that are going to be able to withstand the next event. We have dam safety officials that are still relying on NOAA data on precipitation from the 1960s and 1970s. So these are kind of easier things that Congress can do to start to really address our infrastructure. That's maybe a little bit easier than, for example, finding that solution for the Highway Trust Fund. So there's a lot that Congress can be doing, and our members, from the feedback that I received, and Andy was one of those participants. He can correct me if I'm wrong, but the information that I had received from members is that actually meetings were very positive, and for folks that have been to our fly-in for multiple years. So they actually found that their meetings with legislators this year were better than ever because they actually felt positive and had good conversations that something is going to get done this year, and that members from both sides of the aisle were really focused in a bit more than they have in the past on what some of those solutions are that our members brought forward, because infrastructure is moving and members know that this is happening. So what are those proposals that are going to make the most sense to include in that final package? Andy, was that your experience?
Oh, definitely. They are very supportive of the information because it gives them what they need to talk about to their constituents and also to discuss on the floor of the Senate or the House. They need this information, and they respect the ASCE as engineers for giving it to them. So we were very welcome this year, as in the past.
And I would just add to all of that, we had these 250 members that applied and came to the virtual fly-in. Hopefully next year we can do the fly-in again in person. But it's not just those 250 ASCE members who shared that report card. There's something that everybody can be doing who's an ASCE member. We have a key alert up on our advocacy page right now where you can easily go in and share the report card and share your own infrastructure stories and the projects that are related to your job on a daily basis with your members of Congress in order to push for an infrastructure package. We also, not everyone's always able to come to Washington, D.C., but a lot of our sections have state drive-ins. This is information that's critical to your state legislators as well. As I said earlier, it's states where we've been seeing a lot of this progress being made. I know our Missouri members have a state legislative day next week where they're going to be talking about a gas tax increase bill. So there's a lot of work that can be doing at your state houses. It's not all federal. Right now, yes, today we are focused on the federal, but if you can't make it to Washington, D.C., there's still plenty of opportunities to really be active in your state and in your city.
Carolyn, just to add to what you just said, when we made our visits this year, well, we met with the staff really, but they were very interested in local projects. They actually asked us to send a list of local projects and the dollar values associated to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I just put the link to find your state report cards in the chat box along with the bigger 2021. But there's another question in the chat, Caroline, I hope you can answer. Can we get more information on how to participate on the state drive-ins? Is there one central place to find that information?
So our state drive-ins are generally organized by our sections out in the state. Sometimes they're done on the branch level. Probably the best contact would be your state advocacy captain. And if the person who asked the question let me know their state, I can make sure they're put in touch with their advocacy captain. We do currently have a program at ASCE through our grassroots key contact program where we've created a specially trained group of key contacts that are really leading efforts in their states and leading the outreach in their states, making sure that other people in their state have the information that's necessary, the bills that are maybe moving in the state house, but also trying to organize any federal efforts that are going on. So it's those advocacy captains that we usually rely on to help organize those state drive-ins. So there's not necessarily one central place on our website with that information, but I can put folks in touch with the appropriate people in their state.
Yeah, absolutely. I put my email in the chat box too. If the individual wants to contact me, I can make sure they're connected with the right person. But Ed, you also put additional information in the chat box. Did you want to expand on that?
Sure. I just put our website for our coalition. It's fasterbettersafer.org. And again, you can find out some of the individual projects we highlight and some of our efforts that, again, ASCE works with a variety of stakeholders in this coalition effort, organized labor, to kind of promote various aspects of our infrastructure network. And again, some good information to help you contact your member of Congress or to find out what's going on around the country.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Getting involved locally is just so important. I'll go ahead and turn to our next question. Again, if there's any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat box. But Andy, I'll turn to you next. The Biden administration has tied an infrastructure package to a broader economic recovery effort. ASCE has actually examined the impacts of the nation's infrastructure on the economy with the Failure to Act series. For those of you who are not familiar, that series tried to quantify what the cost of not investing in our infrastructure is costing the economy, families, and businesses. Andy, can you give some more details on the key findings from the 2021 Failure to Act report?
Sure. Well, as you said, every 4 years we come up with the Failure to Act report, and it's an economic impacts of the status quo investment across infrastructure systems. That's its actual title. Basically, what it is what happens if we don't do anything? We don't make any investments in our infrastructure. What's the economic result of that? And as we have in the past, we find out it's a very bad economic result. By 2039, if we continue to underinvest in our infrastructure at our current rates, we'll find ourselves $10 trillion down in gross domestic product. We'll find out that by 2039, we'll have lost 3 million jobs. And over the next 20 years, we will have gone down or not had the opportunity for $2.4 trillion in exports. And the other thing that we do is these are, for business, for America, but we actually look at it from a family basis too. So by 2039, our overdue infrastructure bill will cost the average American household $3,300 a year. That's $63 a week. So when we're not investing in infrastructure, it actually costs us money. And actually, it costs us more than what we would have had to invest in infrastructure to get it up to that grade of B.
Yeah, absolutely. Caroline, did you have something to add?
No, Andy hit it really well, but I think it's those figures that we are seeing really resonate as we're going and talking with congressional offices. It's really those impacts that we're seeing on businesses, and I'm sure Ed can talk more on that with his experience with the chamber, but to families. This is already costing all of us right now. So instead of, paying for those auto repairs every year, I think most people would rather have a smoother ride and pay the money to actually improve the infrastructure. I know myself, I haven't really gone anywhere in the past year other than driving my kids to and from daycare. And due to the rough conditions on Georgia Avenue, we have had our tire pop twice in that time. So it's those kinds of investments that we're all already making. And I would much rather spend a little bit more at the pump than have the hassle of those tire repairs.
I just made a car appointment for tomorrow because I drove to Maryland and my tire light came on because those roads were just so bumpy. So I've got to take my morning tomorrow, when I could be productive and doing work. I've got to take time out of my day to get my car looked at. I'm right there with you, Caroline. But I'll go ahead and turn to Ed for our next question, because again, this is it's so important. It affects each and every one of us, as engineers or also in our personal lives. But Ed, ASCE has worked closely with the Chamber of Commerce to urge Congress to develop bipartisan solutions to our most pressing infrastructure needs. In the current political environment, do you think there's still an opportunity for bipartisan action on infrastructure? If you do believe we can see a bipartisan package, where do you think members of Congress find that common ground to get something done?
Sure. Appreciate the question. And, when Caroline was laying out the ASCE agenda for reauthorization, we agree with, I think, all of those things. Now, you all obviously get involved in some specific engineering requests, but on the big picture stuff, we are hand and foot on glove on these things. We need sustainable funding. We've proposed a variety of ways to do that. We believe you should adjust the fuel tax. We haven't done it, as Caroline said, since 1993. We do want to encourage more alternative source vehicles, and we want to make sure in the short term that they pay approximate the usage of the system. And then as we go to a longer term, we need to transition to a vehicle mile traveled fee. And so how the federal bill can provide that glide path and transition is going to be critical. We cannot have a bill done this year that doesn't provide that type of blueprint. We've had pilot projects at the state level, but we really need to have some federal leadership in showing how we're going to get from the fuel tax to, it won't matter the source of energy to the vehicle. We also believe, climate is a place where, traditionally there had been some back and forth with the business community and particularly the Democratic Party on climate, but business, we just had a hearing at the House Transportation Committee yesterday. Several of our members testified, including several of your members, AECOM, WSP, FedEx. We submitted a statement for the record saying, look, business wants to be part of the climate solution. Now, we would rather use private sector innovation and technology and not necessarily heavy government mandate. But again, I think there's some bipartisan support in that area. Caroline talked about resiliency. I think it's in everyone's interest that make sure that as we modernize the infrastructure, we build it to last, knowing that climate conditions are different today than they were when a lot of this infrastructure was originally built. There's place there for bipartisanship. Some of the ways to pay for it, yes, there is some bipartisanship. As many of the people on this call know that, you go to state and local initiatives, it's usually Republicans and Democrats working together to support investments in infrastructure. I can tell you that the one caution we've laid out is that rolling back some of the tax reform that was done is probably not the best way to do it. We've laid out a variety of other ways, and I think ASC is on board with them, including, utilizing some federal credit instruments like private activity bonds, the TIFIA program. Chairman Neal of the House Ways and Means Committee wants to do Build America bonds, muni bonds. Again, there's a whole toolkit of funding and financing solutions that we can bring to the table here, and then allow project stakeholders to figure out which ones they want to bring. And then the other thing I think that can bring some bipartisanship is delivering projects in a more efficient manner. I don't have to tell engineers the challenges of getting through the environmental process. And again, we want to be good environmental stewards, but we need to have a transparent and timely process. And again, if the answer is no, let's take limited dollars and put those dollars into projects that can get to yes, instead of taking 15 or 20 years to get some projects into construction. I'm sure many of you have worked on some of these projects that by the time they actually get to construction and they're built, the capacity they were meant to handle has already been exceeded. So again, I think there are a lot of areas that can bring bipartisan support. Caroline may have mentioned earlier, infrastructure normally is not a partisan issue. There's an old saying in Washington, there is no Republican road, there's no Democrat bridge. So again, this is a core responsibility of government, right? I mean, we don't need the government to do a lot of things. You could argue they've gotten involved in a lot of things they shouldn't be. But at the federal level, the Constitution requires the federal government to do two things: national defense and interstate commerce. So there is a strong federal role for modernizing our infrastructure. And again, if we get that federal vision, we know that state and local partners are ready to come to the table with solutions as well. But again, it's the federal government that's got to act. We've seen the states and local governments do what they can. But again, without federal vision and investment, we're not going to be able to make the infrastructure modernization investments that Andy talks about. When you look at the report card and you dive into the details, 47,000 bridges structurally deficient, almost 40% of our roads not in good repair. It's America, folks. It's not acceptable. We can do better. And so there's no reason that folks on all parties can come together and say, let's come up with some common sense solutions and show the American people that government can actually work. When was the last time we were able to say that? Government actually worked. This is that opportunity, and we're going to see if we can take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very inspiring, Ed. I love listening to you talk about that vision, and that's great to think about. I know some of those bridge numbers I think about every time I drive over a bridge, and it's absolutely terrifying. I know that's.
You've got Andy on the line. Watch out.
I know. I mean, it's a reality, right? Like that's the situation is just not acceptable. So I've got a question.
A quick interlude into the bridges. This is the first year that we've actually seen the number of fair bridges rise above the number of good bridges. And that's one of the reasons the grade for bridges went down. We're just not keeping up with the maintenance. And if you look at the total cost of that $2.6 trillion, $1.2 trillion is for surface transportation. So we have to start doing something quickly because our stock of infrastructure is just getting older and older.
I know it's scary to think about, as a user. Here's a great question, Caroline. I think you probably are the best person to answer that. I'm a ASC key contact, and I often send the ASC developed letters to our politicians. However, I never receive any responses from those individuals. Do you have recommendations in connecting with the appropriate folks? And I guess maybe, Caroline, you could probably talk about, what kind of response you would expect as a key contact too.
Well, first I'll say that's disappointing because you're going forward and you're contacting your representative or your senator's office and you're not getting a response. That's very disappointing. At a minimum, they should be sending you some sort of form letter of response so that your concerns are addressed. But I would say, especially if you're an ASCE key contact, that we do have some tools available where we can work with you on kind of helping you with your messaging to help ensure that you do get a response. We definitely recommend if you do respond to those key alerts, don't just hit send. Yes, there's a form letter there, you can hit send there, but personalize it. Make sure you're really talking about how this is impacting the district, how this is impacting you in the civil engineering profession. The more you personalize it, the more likely you are to actually get a response to any sort of outreach that you put out there. But I'd also say, there's a lot of opportunities where we are trying to really groom our ASCE members and our key contacts with programs like the Legislative Fly-In, like the Advocacy Captain Program, where you're not just learning more about that messaging, but you are continuing to reach out and really connect with your member of Congress's office. So, opportunities where you might be able to participate in teletown halls, for example. opportunities where you're not always just maybe asking for something, but, you know, for example, we've just put out the report card. That's something that you can be sharing with your members of Congress, and you can start to establish yourself more as a resource for them. So those are just a few different opportunities. Happy to talk with you more offline about it. If you have particular questions or there's a particular office that you can seem to not get a response from, some of the larger Senate offices like California and New York, they have so much mail, so many emails coming in. It can maybe be a little bit harder to respond to all of that. But again, the more you can personalize your message and really tie it back to the district, the more likely you are to get a response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you've put your email in the chat box too, Caroline, so I'm sure this person could reach out to you directly too if they wanted to have some more questions. And I did also put the key contact link in the chat box too, if anyone's interested in participating in that program. I know we've touched on it briefly, Caroline, but is there anything else about the key contact program that you'd want to highlight here as far as people getting involved?
We also have a series of webinars and other content memos and stuff like that we're making sure our key contacts are getting. For example, an infrastructure package comes out, we'll do a full analysis and we'll make sure our key contacts all have that information, as well as webinar series that are in conjunction with that. Additionally, our key contacts get our Friday newsletter, This Week in Washington, where it's an update on everything that happened on Capitol Hill that week. For example, the hearing that Ed talked about previously, we have a write-up on that, we have a blog post on that. So you can learn a little bit more about the issues that are actually happening on Capitol Hill, as well as in state houses across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you guys do a great job in trying to keep everybody engaged as far as what's going on Capitol Hill. So that's great. Great resource for all of the ASC members. So another question in the chat box, can you provide additional insights on the rationale for the new category in the 2021 report card? Andy or Caroline, who's the best person to, maybe Andy?
Yeah, we added stormwater this year to break it out of the wastewater because it is two separate categories, and it gives us a little bit more insight and some more data behind the two categories so we can get a better grade on it. So that's why we split it out, because it's actually two different types of infrastructure.
And we had originally piloted actually through the state report card program, because we weren't really sure what was the data that was available. Is this something we would be able to grade? And we had some success with the state report card program, being able to grade stormwater through that, which is why it ended up rising to the level of the national report card. And just something else to highlight, it wasn't actually a new category, but we did provide for the first time ever a spotlight on broadband. As part of the report card. I call it a spotlight and not a category, because we didn't actually provide a grade for it, although the write-up you will find is pretty much as extensive as the write-ups for the other categories. And that was really as a response that we were hearing more and more from legislators, why wasn't broadband included? Because that's really now becoming considered a part of our nation's infrastructure. So we decided to finally start to focus in on that. We felt that some of the data that was available wasn't quite enough to provide a grade for it. But I think it's something that we'll continue to look at going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's, broadband is so important these days, right? With everyone working from home. I don't think there's anything more important than your internet connection. Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and we've got another question for Ed here. Congress just passed its most recent COVID-19 relief package, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. Does Congress have the appetite to pass another large-scale, multi-trillion-dollar bill for infrastructure? And if so, what are the conversations about how it should be paid for? Additionally, could we finally see a long-term fix for the Highway Trust Fund included in a comprehensive infrastructure bill? So, Ed, what are your thoughts on those things?
Boy, there's a lot in that question.
That's why I almost stopped and broke it up, but that's there.
And I'll start by saying, if I really knew the exact answers of that, God, it'd be great, wouldn't it? But no, they're very good points. We all have those same questions, and glad to walk through some of those concerns. So, look, we did need to pass a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. Critical to get vaccines out there, critical to 60 billion of it went to transportation programs. Again, very critical. And I know we're joining with AASHTO and ARPA to make sure that some of the state and local money could be ineligible for state DOTs to help them get through the period. So again, we think there's some investment in that bill that is going to help the transportation network. Obviously, keeping the transit agencies running is important. Is there an appetite to do more? Absolutely, because our country needs it. The president ran on doing this issue. It's part of his Build Back Better plan. They looked at the COVID relief as kind of getting through the pandemic, and now they're looking to move toward recovery. And again, if you want long-term recovery, you want to create good paying jobs, you want to address climate, you want to address equity, there is nothing better than a nice investment in infrastructure. Look, I don't know what the price tag's going to be. A lot of numbers have been thrown around. As you all know, look, let's not focus on the price tag. Let's focus on what the ASC report card says. We need to make investments. And yes, it's not going to come cheap. And again, we've laid out a bunch of ways to pay for it. We've also laid out, in our view, a few ways we'd rather not pay for it. But the bottom line is, and Andy, you talked about this in the failure to maintain. Right now, doing nothing costs the average American $3,100, according to your failure to maintain report. A lot of the investments we're talking about would cost the average American $125, $150 a year to modernize surface transportation programs. I'm not a math major, but that's a pretty good rate of return. I'm sure those of you and you went to your CFOs of your companies and you gave them those numbers, they'd say, we're in, let's do it. And so, we do believe that there is that opportunity to get this done. Again, if you want sustained long-term growth, we're seeing the economy pick up as people starting getting vaccinated, getting back out there. But again, as you all know, we are behind other parts of the world in a modern infrastructure, and we're in a global economy. We need to make these modernizations knowing that autonomous vehicles, drones are coming online. And right now, we don't have that infrastructure to make them fully effective. And so, the question is, if not now, when? So we are bullish that this is the year, in spite of the press is having a field day saying, oh, we're going to have to change. We're going to have to, charge the wealthy people. We're going to have to raise the corporate tax rate. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in DC with too much time on their hands. Those of us who've been in this infrastructure debate for a while know the reality of how to get it done. And it just comes down to getting our leaders sitting down and saying, we're going to get it done, and making tough decisions. And then it's incumbent on people like us to stand by these elected leaders of Republican, Democrat, Independent, and say, we're going to support you to make these decisions. There used to be an old story in Washington, they're afraid of getting primary. They don't want to vote for a tax increase or investments in this area or that area. It's incumbent upon us to find those elected leaders and say, yes, you can. We're going to support you. We're going to make sure that you are not primaried, or you're not going to lose a primary based on supporting increased investment in infrastructure. So again, there are a lot of headwinds, but there's also a lot of tailwinds on this issue. And we've all worked very hard over the last several years to get it to a point where we really are at a tipping point. We have a great opportunity to get it done. And, like I said, by May, you should start seeing things running through the hill. If we get to July and you don't see a bill in the Congress, then we're all going to start worrying. And Caroline will tell you, we don't want to go through the 30-some extensions of the FAST Act that we went through with MAP 21. And so, we're working every day to make sure that does not happen.
And I just think one point that Ed made is really important to note. It's that, when voters understand where this money is going to and what projects it's going to, investments in infrastructure are very popular. This past November, in the midst of a pandemic with state and local governments having to make really tough budget decisions, 94% of transportation ballot measures actually passed at the polls. That's higher than it's ever been. So voters get it, and they support these investments in infrastructure. So it's really going to be about groups like ASC, like the Chamber of Commerce, and like all of our members to really be going to their legislators and making sure, tying what these dollars are and the projects that are going to be supported by these investments.
The sad thing is that we're actually losing ground. 4 years ago, we only had an investment gap over 10 years of $2.1 trillion. It's up to $2.6 trillion. So we're actually going behind to get up to that B grade. What we estimate is that we have to increase investment from all levels of government and the private sector from 2.5% to 3.5% of the U.S. gross domestic product. Other countries, Europe, Asia, they may be up to 4, 5, and 6%. We're falling behind, and it is, as Ed says, a global economy.
Yeah, it's so important to pull that into context. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I've got 2 questions in the chat box hopefully we can get to. But this is a great one from a future engineers, right? At the university level, we see many students, next generation engineers and managers of the nation's infrastructure can be quite passionate about sustainability and resilience generally. What opportunities do you see in leveraging these interests from the classroom and beyond for a long view of infrastructure? Andy, is that something that you can speak to?
Well, one of our recommendations is resilience. And we want to utilize new approaches, new materials, new technologies to make sure our infrastructure can hold up to natural or man-made hazards. And we have seen advances in resilience as we look at the report cards, as we go from year to year. We've seen new materials, new construction methods, ways to make our infrastructure harder to be able to withstand the hurricanes, the tsunamis, anything that's affecting them, especially from global climate change. So it is part of our recommendation, and we do want to include it when we're asking to improve our infrastructure.
And I would just add that ASCE is actually quite unique compared to a lot of other industry groups that are out there talking about infrastructure investment, and that's because of all the codes and standards that we have. And we've been having a lot of conversations with staff in Capitol Hill, with, for example, the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, talking about ASCE's codes and standards and how they can be utilized in order to make sure we're building more sustainably and more resiliently, and trying to incorporate more of those codes and standards at the federal level, at the state level, to make sure that the infrastructure that we're building is meeting those standards.
Tirza, if I could add to that. So, from the business community perspective, those young people, when they graduate school and they're looking to live somewhere, they're looking to live somewhere that has a sustainable community, that has interconnected infrastructure. And so, the business community is always looking, how do we attract those high-skilled workers? Well, guess what? Providing those types of community options is a big part of that solution. So I can tell you, many of my state and local chambers are working with their communities to try to provide those types of sustainable multimodal options, because they understand to attract that workforce, those are the types of investments they need to make sure they are able to attract the very limited skill set of the high-skilled millennial worker.
That's an excellent point, Ed. That's, something I've never even fathomed. So that's a great perspective. So here's another question in the chat box. How does gas tax help if or when we go to alternative fuel sources? How do we make sure they don't just collect the money and use it for something else like they did with Social Security? I'd almost kind of want to break those questions up into 2 separate questions, but I guess Ed I was told you were the one to ask all the hard questions, so this seems like this one goes to you.
Well, I was actually saying it was Caroline, but I'll take it. I'll take that one, because I get a lot of questions, because a lot of people are like, why is the U.S. Chamber talking about raising the gas tax, and why are we talking about sustainable funding sources? Well, look, we do believe that, as the transition occurs, we believe in the concept that users pay, right? Dwight Eisenhower developed the interstate highway system that way. Both Republican and Democrat administrations have supported adjusting the fuel tax. So again, as we transition, we have to look at, making sure all users, whether it's electric, which is getting a lot of buzz right now, but I will tell folks, and I remind folks this, it's getting a lot of buzz. You're hearing a lot of talk about 500,000 charging stations. Right now, only about 1.5% of all vehicle miles traveled uses something other than gasoline and diesel. So as aspirational as a lot of our goals are in the electric, the hydrogen is also another option that people are looking at. For the next 20 years, the vast majority of vehicles are going to be gasoline and diesel. So, the question is a good one in the sense that we need to keep the highway trust fund. There's been some talk of maybe let's just get rid of the highway trust fund and have the general fund of the government pay for it. Having a highway trust fund and making sure those dedicated taxes and fees go into that fund for a dedicated purpose has been really critical. And so again, as these electric vehicles and other alternative source vehicles, we're going to insist the funds that they pay to use this system don't just go into the general treasury; they go into the trust fund. Now, to the question, look, we always are on the watch for them to try to take money. You mentioned the Social Security question, but we've been on them. We've been able to protect the highway trust fund over the last many years. We've actually been on the other side of that. We've actually been dipping in 1/3 of all highway funding now is general fund because we haven't raised the gasoline tax. So we're actually on the other end of that curve. We're kind of guilty of that. And so we'd like to have an adjustment to get back to users of the system are paying for the modernization of it.
And I think I've seen in the past it takes more than a generation to actually fully turn over a fleet of vehicles on the road. So we've got a long time before the gas tax would need to be fully phased out. But at ASCE, we support an increase of the gas tax, but we also support starting to tax EVs at the federal level now before there are too many on the road. Because when you have less EV users, it's going to be a little bit easier to institute that tax now than do it down the road when the majority of the fleet is on EVs. So it's about not just raising the gas tax to try to get us through the short term, but start looking at more of those long-term funding options, like how we're making sure EVs are paying their fair share. Is it a vehicle miles traveled? Well, these are things we need to be implementing now as we're getting closer and closer to electrification. But again, as Ed had said, we do have a good 20 years probably before we're seeing the entire fleet turned over.
One of the things Ed mentioned was vehicle miles traveled. That could be a way to substitute for the gas tax by charging everybody by how many miles you drive on the highways. I mean, it's definitely a user fee. There's been some studies I think out in the state of Washington and maybe somewhere in the Midwest to see how it would work. So that's something else in the future that might make it more equitable for everybody using the highways.
Absolutely. So I know we've got about 3 minutes left, and there were 2 outstanding questions I don't think we're able to get to in the chat box. But I'll go ahead and send those out to you all and see if maybe we can post those within ASC Collaborate to get some answers there, and then see what other ASC members that might also chime in. I know this question about future world vision, I can think of a few people that would be interested in answering that question from a member standpoint. So I'll go ahead and wrap everything up. So to close, do you think this year might be different? Will the attention on infrastructure finally result in the comprehensive legislation that this nation needs to raise the grades? So Caroline, I'll turn to you first.
I feel optimistic. I feel probably more optimistic than I have in years. I really do think something's going to be getting done this year. At a minimum, I think we're going to definitely see a surface transportation reauthorization, but I do think we're going to see more than that. I do think we're going to see our drinking water and wastewater systems being addressed. I think we can be seeing funding for our dams and levees, etc. I feel optimistic, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure we kind of keep Congress honest and keep them to a deadline of getting something done this summer.
Absolutely. Andy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I hope that we only have one infrastructure week this year, rather than the 3 or 4 that we had last year. But I am, as Carolyn, I'm also optimistic that something is actually going to be happening this year. I just think that Congress is in a position where it's ready to do something. And I think the U.S. public wants them to do it, and you can see from the polls.
Absolutely. Ed, what are your thoughts?
Look, I agree with Caroline and Andy. Look, we have all built this debate up to the point where it's teed up for action. Again, everyone on this call has done a lot of work to highlight the needs and document it. May it meet every need that we need addressed? It probably won't. But I think, like Caroline said, substantially a surface bill, a water bill, broadband. I feel very confident about them. How we go beyond that, that's still to be determined. But, again, this is the year we can get it done, because we got, a president who ran on doing it, president that ran on bipartisanship. There is no issue that can bring our country together as much as infrastructure modernization. So let's go get it done.
Awesome.
That's
So encouraging. Sorry, Caroline, what was that?
I said it's a great way to end it.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you to our great team of panelists. This has been such a fabulous and very encouraging conversation, right? So again, for ASC members, remember you can always continue this conversation in ASC Collaborate at collaborate.asc.org. I put the link in the chat box, so the outstanding questions I'll go ahead and post there. For those of you who are not yet ASC members, I'd be happy to talk more with you about the benefits and resources that ASC provides. So please feel free to contact me. I did put my email in the chat box. Again, thank you for this great team of panelists. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. So thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.